The breeze rolling in from the deep ocean carried a quiet song of freedom, its soft whisper rising and falling with the rhythm of the waves. The fisherman stood at the edge of the pier, steady and unhurried, casting his line into the calm, glassy water. From time to time he paused, not to check his catch, but to breathe. He filled his lungs with the sharp, salty air and let it settle his mind. This was his ritual, a borrowed moment of peace before the city reclaimed him with its noise and demands. But today the air felt different. A faint tension crept along his skin, subtle yet undeniable, like the ocean itself was holding its breath. He lifted his eyes toward the horizon, his brow tightening as he focused. At first he dismissed it, a shimmer of light, a trick of distance. The sea often played such games. Then the shapes sharpened. One sail became many, many became hundreds. Dark silhouettes rose along the eastern horizon, swallowing the evening sun and turning the water beneath them into a strip of shadow. The fisherman's chest tightened. His pulse thundered in his ears as the truth settled in, cold and absolute. He knew what this meant. His rod slipped from his hands and struck the pier with a hollow clatter. Without looking back, he ran. The peaceful hush of the shoreline shattered beneath his pounding feet as he tore through the streets, breath burning in his lungs. Cobblestones blurred beneath him. Faces turned, startled by his urgency, sensing that something was terribly wrong. Shouts followed him, but he didn't slow. There was no time. The city had to know. By the time the gates came into view, the watchtowers were already alive with movement. Warning bells rang out, their harsh rhythm slicing through the air and echoing down every street. The king's guard surged into formation, steel flashing as polished armour caught the light. Orders were barked. Gates groaned open and then slammed shut. They had been waiting for something. One of the guards, a young man hardened beyond his years, a pale scar cutting down his left cheek, broke from the ranks and sprinted toward the castle. His boots struck stone in rapid succession, the echoes chasing him through the long vaulted corridors. Servants flattened themselves against the walls as he passed. He did not slow. He reached the throne room and shoved the heavy doors open. Inside, a council was already in session. Advisers leaned over an intricately carved table, voices low, arguments measured. Generals stood with arms crossed, maps spread beneath their hands. It was the familiar tension of governance, controlled, deliberate. It lasted only a heartbeat. The guard crossed the chamber and dropped to one knee before the throne. Though his breathing was rough, his voice did not waver. His eyes, however, betrayed the urgency he struggled to contain. "Forgive the interruption, my lord," he said, "but the eastern horizon is black with sails. Hundreds of ships are advancing toward the city, and they move with purpose." The room shifted. The king straightened in his seat. He was a man in his middle years, his crown a quiet blend of silver and gold resting upon his brow. His expression remained composed, yet a flicker, brief and unmistakable, passed across his eyes. He glanced at his closest adviser, who needed no words. A subtle gesture sent the generals into motion. "Our forces?" the king asked, his voice low, steady, absolute. "Awaiting your command, my lords and Arn," the guard replied. "Archers are positioned along the walls. Ballistae are armed and ready. The fleet is still hours away, but they advance with haste." Silence settled over the chamber, heavy and uninvited. The king rose and turned toward the tall window behind his throne. Below, the city carried on, unaware, alive. Beyond it, the ocean stretched outward, endless and indifferent. On the distant line where sea met sky, dark shapes multiplied, growing larger with every passing moment. The calm had passed. War was coming. "The time has come," the king said quietly, yet the words carried the full weight of the crown. "Summon the captains, ready the soldiers. We will not let our city fall." The guard bowed once and turned, his armour clinking sharply as he hurried from the chamber. The moment he was gone, the council erupted into motion. Maps were dragged across the table. Voices overlapped, measured, urgent. Orders were issued and dispatched before doubts could take root. Beyond the castle walls, the city stirred with anxious purpose. Blacksmiths worked without pause, hammers ringing against steel as sparks lit the air. Citizens rushed through the streets, gathering food, binding possessions, whispering prayers. Fear hung thick, blending with the familiar scent of salt carried in from the sea. From a nearby hill, the fisherman watched. The sails were closer now, no longer distant shapes, but a creeping mass, spreading across the horizon like a living shadow. He felt no pride in having raised the alarm, only a hollow stillness. He had done what he could. The rest no longer belonged to him. The wind rose, carrying the crash of waves against the shore. The ocean's song remained, but it had changed. What once promised freedom now whispered of blood and iron. Back in the council chamber, the king stood tall, his presence commanding silence. "Prepare our ships," he said, his voice calm, unyielding. "Send messengers to the mountain guard posts. No army has ever taken this city. No army is strong enough." Each word landed with the weight of history. Centuries of walls unbroken, banners unfallen. He turned from the table and walked toward the towering window that overlooked the city below, its streets winding between massive stone defences. No one spoke. Faintly, from beyond the walls, came the sounds of preparation. Steel being sharpened, armour fastened, boots marching in rhythm. "There won't be a war," the king continued, his voice low now, precise. "There will be an assassination." The words lingered, heavy and suffocating. He turned back to face the council, his gaze moving slowly from face to face. This was not a battle of numbers or strength. This was a contest of shadows, of patience, deception and timing. Several council members exchanged uneasy glances. They had prepared for sieges, for bloodshed in the open. This was something else entirely. The king's eyes settled on his chief adviser, a wiry man with greying hair and eyes honed by decades of calculation. "I want you to oversee it," the king said. "Gather our best. Make sure they understand what is at stake." The adviser inclined his head once. "It will be done, my lord." Satisfied, the king drew a measured breath and strode toward the massive doors at the far end of the hall. "We will reconvene shortly," he said, already dismissing them. The doors swung open, and he vanished down the corridor, his cloak trailing behind him like a shadow of command. The council remained still for a moment longer, the weight of his words settling in. Then, one by one, they rose. Quiet murmurs followed as they departed, each carrying a different burden: confidence, doubt, dread. The chief adviser lingered. He stared at the grand table where countless decisions had shaped the fate of the city. His mouth tightened into a thin line. Then he turned sharply and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the stone halls. He knew what this mission meant, and how easily it could decide everything. In the streets below, the city moved as one vast, restless organism. Steel rang against steel as armour was fastened and weapons distributed. Commands were shouted, repeated, carried along stone corridors and overcrowded squares. Soldiers streamed towards the walls and inner defences, taking their places with practised urgency. High above the city, messenger birds were released in quick succession, wings beating hard as they vanished toward the mountains. At the ancient watchtowers, perched along the ridgelines, guards leaned forward against the wind, eyes fixed on the sea. The enemy fleet advanced steadily, no rush, no hesitation, each ship a promise of what was coming. From his vantage point on the hill, the fisherman watched the city strain beneath the weight of preparation. His pulse thudded in his ears. The sails on the horizon were no longer distant shapes. They loomed now, dark and unmistakable, like storm clouds rolling in to blot out the light. Then something else caught his eye. Near the castle's side gate, half hidden by shadow and stone, a small group emerged. Cloaked figures slipped through the opening without sound, their movements precise, deliberate. They didn't hurry. They did not speak. In the chaos around them, they were nearly invisible. Nearly. The fisherman's breath caught. Assassins. Understanding settled over him with a quiet, unsettling clarity. This war would not be decided by walls or numbers, by arrows or steel clashing in the open. The king was striking at something far deeper, something unseen. The fisherman remained still as the figures vanished into the city's veins, the wind tugging at his clothes. Below him, the city prepared for war. Somewhere within it, the real battle had already begun. He glanced back toward the ocean. The enemy ships were still some distance away, yet they crept closer with every passing breath. The wind from the deep sea continued its song, once a promise of freedom, now laced with something darker. It carried the scent of salt, but beneath it lingered the faint suggestion of blood and betrayal. High above the city, the king stood alone on the castle's highest balcony. He fixed his gaze on the horizon, eyes narrowing as the fleet came fully into view. This was not what he had expected. He had prepared for an armada, dozens upon dozens of warships, a force meant to crush walls through sheer weight and fire. Instead, only a handful cut through the water. Roughly 20 ships advanced toward Shadow Bay, their dark sails taut in the wind, their formation precise. Too precise. They moved with confidence, unhurried, as though numbers were irrelevant. A faint crease formed between the king's brows. Disappointment flickered across his face, but it didn't last. 20 ships could not conquer a city like his. Not by siege, not by force, unless force was never the intention. The king's fingers tightened against the stone railing as understanding began to stir. This was no display of strength. It was restraint, a deliberate choice. And restraint, he knew, was often the mark of something far more dangerous than brute power. Below him, the city braced for war. Above the sea, the wind carried its song onward, no longer a warning, but a quiet promise that the true threat had yet to reveal itself.